In January 1942, the United States Army signed a $25 million contract to build a massive training camp on 56,000 acres of Texas prairie north of Bastrop, gave the contractors 108 working days to complete it. And nobody in that quiet farming region understood how completely their world was about to change. What happened over the next 4 years at Camp Swift became one of the most remarkable transformations in American military history, a story about elite ski troops training in brutal Texas heat, thousands of German prisoners working alongside local farmers, and a community that virtually disappeared overnight to make room for what would become the largest Army training camp in Texas. I first learned about Camp Swift from a man who'd watched the whole thing happen as a teenager living on land his family had farmed for 3 generations. Told me how Army engineers showed up in early 1942 with surveys and purchase orders. Gave his parents 90 days to pack up everything they owned and leave. Watched bulldozers tear down the house where he was born before the moving truck even pulled away from what used to be home. The land the Army chose for Camp Swift was rolling prairie and pine forest in Bastrop County, 28 miles east of Austin and 7 miles north of the town of Bastrop, scattered with small homesteads and hamlets connected by unpaved roads. About 200 families lived there, according to county records, farming small parcels, raising livestock, working timber, living quiet lives that had gone on pretty much unchanged since their grandparents settled the area in the 1800s. One of those families belonged to a Frenchman named Antoine Ossiu, who'd immigrated decades earlier and built himself a winery with vineyard that produced decent wine until Prohibition killed the business. His stone wine cellar and the dam he'd constructed on Big Sandy Creek still stood there in 1942 when the Army came, remnants of prosperity that had faded but not quite disappeared, symbols of how even successful enterprises could vanish when circumstances changed. 2 small lignite mines had operated in the area during the 1920s near the Sayersville community. Employed immigrant Mexican laborers who worked the shallow deposits, another layer of the region's complex history that most people had forgotten by the time war came. The area had always been multicultural in quiet ways that didn't draw much attention, people from different places making lives together on land that seemed endless. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly, everything accelerated. The Army needed training facilities immediately, needed them scattered across the country far from coasts where enemy attack seemed possible. Needed climates and terrain that could prepare soldiers for wherever they might fight. Texas offered space and weather and political willingness to host massive installations, had already proven itself with camps built after the First War that still existed. The Army's Quartermaster General identified the Bastrop County site in late 1941, sent engineers to survey and assess, determined that 56,000 acres could accommodate the kind of massive training facility the expanding Army required. In January 1942, they signed contracts with construction companies and began the process of buying out or condemning every piece of property within the designated boundaries. Families received notices that their land was needed for the war effort, got offers that seemed fair on paper but didn't account for the emotional cost of leaving homes that held generations of memory. Some sold willingly, proud to contribute to defending the country, figured they could buy land somewhere else and start over. Others fought the condemnation in court and lost, watched their property get seized through eminent domain, left bitter about government power that could erase communities when military necessity demanded. By March 1942, the contractors had mobilized thousands of workers and began the largest construction project Bastrop County had ever seen, maybe the largest anyone in that part of Texas had witnessed outside of wartime. Heavy equipment rolled across farmland, transforming fields into roads, pine forest into cleared ground for buildings, creeks into drainage systems, existing landscape into military installation almost overnight. The contract specified completion in 108 working days, according to Army requirements. meant 2,700 buildings had to go up in less than 4 months. Barracks and mess halls and headquarters, structures and hospitals and warehouses, and everything else needed to house and train tens of thousands of soldiers. The pace was relentless. Construction crews working around the clock, trucks hauling materials constantly, the sound of hammers and saws and diesel engines echoing across what had been quiet countryside. Local residents watched in amazement as Camp Swift took shape, saw a complete city rise where farms had been, realized the scale of what war required in ways that newspaper reports and radio broadcasts couldn't convey. This was industrial warfare happening right in front of them, the mobilization of a nation made visible and concrete and impossible to ignore. The first building stood finished by summer 1942, even before the whole camp was completed, started receiving support staff, and preparing for troops who would arrive as soon as training facilities were ready. The official opening came in stages throughout late 1942 and early 1943, different units arriving as their designated areas became functional, the camp filling up gradually until it reached capacity. Camp Swift was named after Major General Eben Swift, a World War I commander and military theorist who'd written extensively about tactical doctrine. Appropriate that a training facility focused on preparing soldiers for modern warfare would honor someone who'd thought deeply about how armies should function. The name gave the place legitimacy and history, even though the physical installation was brand new, connected it to military tradition that stretched back through previous conflicts. The camp's design followed standard Army layout, approved for training facilities across the country, organized into distinct areas for different functions. Administration buildings clustered near the main entrance, barracks spread across vast sections in neat rows, training grounds and firing ranges occupied the perimeter, motor pools and maintenance facilities filled designated zones. Everything was planned for maximum efficiency, moving troops through their training cycle as quickly and effectively as possible. The barracks were standard wooden structures covered with tar paper. Designed for 20-year temporary lifespan, which turned out to be optimistic since none of the original buildings survive today, except 2 that got moved to Blackshear Elementary School less than a mile from the original camp boundaries. The construction was functional rather than comfortable, meant to house soldiers during training, not provide permanent accommodation. Adequate for the purpose, but nothing more. By late 1943, Camp Swift was fully operational, and training thousands of troops simultaneously had become one of the most important military facilities in Texas and one of the largest training camps in the entire country. The numbers were staggering, the camp designed to accommodate 44,000 troops, but eventually housing up to 90,000 at peak capacity. More soldiers than the entire population of Bastrop County before the war. Then something unexpected started happening that would add another dimension to Camp Swift's story and create one of those strange wartime ironies that nobody could have predicted. You won't believe what showed up at this massive Texas training camp in the middle of preparing American soldiers for combat. Today, welcome to this channel and to an authentic World War II story in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter. I'm 80 years old, a retired military and World War II veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. German prisoners of war, thousands of them, captured in North Africa and shipped across the Atlantic to be held in camps throughout the United States because the British didn't have facilities or resources to house the massive numbers surrendering after Rommel's Afrika Korps collapsed in Tunisia. The first German prisoners arrived at Camp Swift in 1943, according to military records, eventually numbering close to 10,000 at peak capacity, held in separate compounds away from the American troops, but sharing the same Texas landscape. The Germans lived behind barbed wire with guard towers and armed patrols. But the conditions were relatively comfortable by wartime standards, adequate food and shelter and medical care, as required by Geneva Convention. Most of the German prisoners were enlisted men and non-commissioned officers captured in North Africa, veterans of desert warfare who found themselves in another kind of difficult climate, trading scorching sand for humid Texas heat. They could be required to work according to international law, couldn't be used for anything directly supporting the war effort, but could labor on agricultural projects and infrastructure that freed American workers for defense industries. Local farmers desperately needed labor, with so many young men overseas fighting, faced the real possibility of crops rotting in fields because there weren't enough hands to harvest them. The War Department authorized a program allowing farmers to employ prisoner labor, paying the government $1.50 per prisoner per day, the prisoners receiving 80 cents in canteen coupons they could spend at camp stores. The sight of German POWs working Texas farms became common throughout 1943 and 1944. Truckloads of prisoners in work clothes with PW painted on their pants legs, heading out each morning to pick cotton or harvest pecans or work timber, guarded by American soldiers but otherwise functioning like any agricultural labor crew. The arrangement benefited everyone involved. Farmers got workers they needed, prisoners earned money and escaped boredom of camp life, government offset costs of the POW program. Some local residents felt uncomfortable about enemy soldiers working on American land, resented that Germans lived relatively well while American boys died overseas, couldn't reconcile the strange normalcy of prisoners doing everyday farm work with the violence happening on distant battlefields. Others appreciated the practical reality that without prisoner labor, their farms would fail and food production would suffer, understood that treating POWs humanely might protect American prisoners in German camps. The prisoners at Camp Swift also worked on camp maintenance and repair projects, fixed worn field equipment and uniforms in the camp's clothing and equipment section, painted murals that decorated buildings around the installation. Photographs of those murals got preserved in archives at the Texas State Library in Austin, evidence of the artistic skill some prisoners possessed and the strange cultural exchange happening behind the wire. But the most remarkable thing about Camp Swift wasn't the German prisoners, wasn't even the massive scale of the training operation, was something so unexpected that nobody involved could quite believe it was happening. Elite mountain troops trained to fight in snow and ice, soldiers who'd spent years learning to ski and climb rock faces and survive in alpine conditions, found themselves stationed in hot, humid Texas prairie, where the closest thing to a mountain was a gentle hill, and the only ice was in drinks served at the canteen. The 10th Mountain Division, America's only specialized mountain warfare unit, spent crucial months at Camp Swift in 1944 before deploying to Italy, and the experience was surreal for everyone involved. The 10th Mountain Division had been created specifically to fight in harsh alpine terrain after military planners realized the United States had no troops trained for mountain warfare. Watched Finnish soldiers use difficult landscape to devastating effect against the Soviet invasion in 1940, saw Italian forces lose 25,000 men in Albanian mountains because they weren't prepared for that environment. The division trained for over a year at Camp Hale in Colorado, 9,000 feet high in the Rockies between Leadville and what would later become Vail, soldiers learning to move and fight on skis, mastering rock climbing techniques, enduring brutal winter conditions that pushed them to physical and mental limits. The training was legendary, particularly the D-Series maneuvers in March 1944, when soldiers spent 3 weeks conducting mock combat operations in sub-zero temperatures, carrying 90-pound rucksacks. Conditions so harsh that nearly 200 cases of frostbite and over 300 other injuries resulted. The soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division were different from typical infantry. Many came from college ski clubs and mountain resort communities. Included some of the best-known skiers and climbers in America, men who volunteered specifically because they wanted to use their outdoor skills in military service. About 50% had attended college at a time when only 10% of American soldiers had higher education, brought sophistication and specialized knowledge that made them unique within the Army. They trained with thousands of pack mules, specially selected for mountain work, dealt with notoriously difficult animals that could carry heavy loads up steep terrain, but required patience and skill to handle. The mules became infamous among the troops. Stories about wrestling with stubborn animals in Colorado snow became legendary within the division. Soldiers developed complicated relationships with creatures they both depended on and cursed regularly. Then, in June 1944, after all that specialized mountain training, the entire division got shipped to Camp Swift, Texas, for infantry training and acclimatization to low altitude and hot climate, preparation for maneuvers in Louisiana that eventually got canceled. The move was meant to be temporary, a pause before deployment, but it turned into months of waiting in an environment completely wrong for mountain troops. The soldiers arrived in Texas wearing their specialized mountain gear, carrying ski equipment and climbing tools they couldn't use on flat prairie, found themselves doing standard infantry drills in 100-degree heat after years training in Colorado winter. The contrast was absurd. Elite troops specialized for specific terrain stuck doing basic exercises in conditions they'd never expected to fight in, their unique skills suddenly irrelevant. Morale plummeted according to accounts from veterans. The soldiers felt frustrated and confused, worried that all their specialized training was being wasted, feared they might get broken up and distributed to regular infantry units to replace casualties from D-Day and the fighting in France. Rumors circulated constantly. Nobody knew what was planned for them. The waiting and uncertainty worse than the physical discomfort of Texas summer. The German prisoners at Camp Swift watched this elite American division with interest and some amusement, saw soldiers who'd trained to fight in snow struggling with heat and humidity, recognized the irony of mountain troops stuck on flat ground. Some prisoners who'd fought in Russia and Norway had their own experience with alpine warfare, understood what the Americans had trained for and why Texas made no sense for that kind of unit. Then something unexpected happened that validated all the specialized training and gave the 10th Mountain Division the deployment they'd been preparing for. In November 1944, the division got orders to deploy to Italy, where Allied forces had stalled in the Apennine Mountains, trying to break through German defensive positions, needed troops who could fight effectively in that challenging terrain. The soldiers finally received the mountain tab and shoulder patch they'd been waiting for. Official recognition of their specialized status, sailed for Naples in December, just as winter set in across the Italian mountains. The contrast between Camp Swift and the Italian front was dramatic. The division went from hot Texas prairie to snow-covered peaks in a matter of weeks, finally got to use the skills they'd developed in Colorado against an enemy that thought mountain positions made them unbeatable. In February 1945, the 10th Mountain Division launched attacks on Monte Riva and Monte Belvedere, broke through German lines that other units had failed to penetrate, proved that specialized mountain training made a critical difference in alpine warfare. The division's success in Italy vindicated the years of preparation, and the frustrating detour through Texas showed that creating specialized units for specific terrain was worth the investment even when it seemed wasteful. The soldiers who'd sweated through summer at Camp Swift and wondered if their training mattered ended up playing crucial roles in the final Italian offensive, their mountain warfare skills proving decisive in terrain that had stopped conventional forces. Back at Camp Swift, the training continued throughout 1944 and into 1945, other divisions cycling through including the 95th, 97th, and 102nd Infantry Divisions, tank destroyer battalions, support units. Approximately 300,000 soldiers trained there before the war ended. The camp was constantly busy, troops arriving fresh from basic training to learn advanced tactics, then shipping out for combat overseas, the cycle repeating endlessly. The camp also trained nurses for battlefield conditions, prepared medical personnel to operate under combat stress, gave them realistic scenarios that would help them function effectively when soldiers' lives depended on their skills. The presence of women at the overwhelmingly male installation added another dimension to camp life, reminded everyone that modern warfare required diverse skills and all kinds of service. Local communities adjusted to living next to this massive military presence. Bastrop and surrounding towns filled with off-duty soldiers looking for entertainment. Local businesses boomed, serving troops with money to spend. The economic impact of Camp Swift transformed the entire region. Some locals worked at the camp in various capacities. Others provided services and goods. Everyone's life got affected by having 90,000 soldiers and 10,000 prisoners within a few miles. The relationship between the German prisoners and local population remained complicated throughout the war. Farmers who employed prisoner labor generally spoke positively about their work ethic and skill, appreciated that the program kept their farms operating. But others never got comfortable with enemy soldiers living among them, felt the cognitive dissonance of treating Germans well while Americans fought them overseas, wrestled with conflicting emotions that didn't resolve easily. A few prisoners died during their time at Camp Swift from natural causes or accidents, received military funerals with full honors as required by Geneva Convention. On October 29, 1943, a German prisoner of war funeral was held at Camp Swift, according to military photographs preserved in National Archives. American soldiers standing at attention as they buried a man who'd been their enemy, honoring shared humanity that persisted despite the war. The prisoners built lives within the camp, despite being captives, organized soccer leagues and theatrical productions, took educational courses, published camp newspapers, maintained routines that gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together. Some kept journals or wrote letters home that revealed their complicated feelings about captivity in America, grateful for decent treatment, but homesick and guilty about being safe while Germany was being destroyed. Escape attempts were rare and generally unsuccessful. Texas was too far inland and too vast for prisoners to have any realistic chance of reaching neutral territory or returning to German forces. A few tried anyway, motivated by sense of duty or just desperate need to do something active rather than passively wait for war's end. All the escapees got caught relatively quickly, usually within days, sometimes hours, the geography and local population making successful escape nearly impossible. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the mood at Camp Swift shifted dramatically. The comfortable relationship that had developed between guards and prisoners suddenly felt inappropriate now that victory was achieved. Food quality declined. Privileges got reduced, the atmosphere became less friendly as American authorities wrestled with how to treat defeated enemy while celebrating triumph. Repatriation didn't happen immediately, despite prisoner expectations. American authorities kept POWs through late 1945 into 1946 using their labor, while American soldiers demobilized and came home. The prisoners felt betrayed, thought surrender meant immediate return to Germany, discovered they remained imprisoned even after war ended. But Germany was occupied and divided and destroyed, millions homeless and starving. Staying in American camps was probably safer than returning to that chaos. Most prisoners eventually got shipped to England, Scotland, France, or Belgium, where they worked on farms and in mines and repaired war damage for 1 to 2 years before final repatriation to Germany. They traded American captivity for European labor, comfortable camps, like Swift, for harder conditions under nations Germany had invaded. Many later said their time in Texas had been the best period of their captivity, that American treatment was fair and decent compared to what followed. By January 1946, all the German prisoners were gone from Camp Swift, the last compounds emptied and closed, that strange chapter of enemy soldiers working Texas farms finally over. The Army officially closed Camp Swift shortly after, declared the buildings and land surplus, began liquidating assets and preparing for post-war transition. The massive installation that had dominated Bastrop County for 4 years suddenly stood empty. 2,700 buildings waiting for new purpose, 56,000 acres needing new use, a complete city that had housed 100,000 people, now silent and abandoned. The Army auctioned off buildings to anyone who wanted them. People bought barracks for lumber and equipment for pennies on dollar, dismantled structures and hauled away materials. The physical camp disappearing almost as fast as it had appeared. The gymnasium got relocated to Whitney, Texas, where it still serves the school district today, one of the few camp buildings that found useful second life. 2 barracks got moved to Blackshear Elementary School near the original campsite, preserved as reminders of what had existed there. Everything else vanished, sold or demolished or left to deteriorate, the massive infrastructure of Camp Swift erased from the landscape. Most of the land got returned to original owners or their heirs, who'd been displaced in 1942. Families came back to property that no longer resembled what they'd left, found their homesteads destroyed and replaced with barren ground where buildings had stood, had to decide whether to try farming again or sell to new buyers. Some rebuilt and stayed, others took the opportunity to leave for cities where post-war economy offered different possibilities. The government retained approximately 11,700 acres as military reservation, recognized that training facilities would still be needed for National Guard and reserve forces, kept enough land to maintain a functional base. The rest went back into private ownership, got divided and sold, became farms again, or small ranches, or eventually residential development as the area grew. The University of Texas established a cancer research center on part of the former campsite, medical facility, that continues operating today, conducting important research, peaceful purpose for land that trained soldiers for war. The Texas National Guard maintained training facilities on the government portion, continues using Camp Swift today for exercises and preparation, preserves the military connection that began in 1942. Then something unexpected happened that gave part of Camp Swift a purpose nobody would have imagined during the war years. The federal government built a medium-security prison on a portion of the old campsite, $11 million facility for first-time offenders that opened in later decades. Ironic transformation from place that trained soldiers and held prisoners of war to place that permanently imprisons American criminals. The federal correctional institution Bastrop operates today on land where German POWs once worked and American troops once trained. Another layer in the site's complicated history. Scattered housing developments grew up around the former camp boundaries. Residential areas with names that sometimes referenced the military history, but mostly just treated the land as available space for construction. The area's population increased gradually, people moving there for affordability and proximity to Austin, unaware or unconcerned about what had happened on that ground decades earlier. The 2 barracks at Blackshear Elementary School stand as physical reminders of Camp Swift's existence, buildings that once housed soldiers now educating children, transformation that symbolizes how war infrastructure gets repurposed for peace. Students walk through structures where nervous 19-year-olds slept before shipping out to combat, probably don't think much about the history contained in those walls. Antoine Osilou's ruined wine cellar and the stone dam he built on Big Sandy Creek still exist within current Camp Swift boundaries, according to historical surveys, remnants from before the military came, evidence that the land had history predating the war and might have history continuing after all traces of Camp Swift disappear completely. Those stone structures outlasted the wooden barracks and will probably outlast the memory of what happened there. The speed of Camp Swift's creation and dissolution reveals something important about American capacity for mobilization, ability to build massive facilities almost overnight when necessity demands, then dismantle them equally fast when purpose is fulfilled. Within 4 years, a complete city appeared and disappeared, trained 300,000 soldiers, held 10,000 enemy prisoners, transformed a rural region, then vanished, leaving only scattered traces. The families displaced in 1942 experienced traumatic disruption that gets forgotten in larger narratives about winning the war. Their sacrifice was necessary, but real. Compensation was fair by government standards, but couldn't replace homes and communities and ways of life that disappeared. Some maintained bitterness about the taking of their land. Others made peace with it as contribution to victory. All of them had to adapt to changes they didn't choose. The German prisoners carried complicated memories back to Europe. Time spent in Texas represented strange interlude in their war experience, period when they were safe and relatively comfortable while their nation was being destroyed. Some returned to visit decades later, wanted to see the place again, thank people who'd treated them decently, make peace with that chapter of their lives. Others wanted to forget, found the whole experience shameful or confusing, preferred not to revisit memories of defeat and captivity. The soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division, who trained at Camp Swift and then fought in Italy, created legacy that extended beyond their military service. Many returned to civilian life and helped develop American ski industry, founded resorts and ski schools, designed equipment, taught skiing, transformed winter recreation in ways that shaped subsequent generations. Their time in hot Texas seemed pointless while it was happening, but turned out to be just a pause before they accomplished what they'd trained for. The nurses who trained at Camp Swift went on to serve in combat hospitals, saved lives under conditions nobody should have to work in, and returned home with experiences that marked them permanently, often felt their contributions got overlooked in narratives focused on combat soldiers. The training they received at Camp Swift helped prepare them for that service, gave them skills they wouldn't have developed elsewhere. The local communities that lived through Camp Swift's existence adapted to massive changes they hadn't anticipated, found their quiet rural area transformed into major military hub, experienced economic boom that came with military presence, then adjusted again when it all disappeared. The collective memory of that period faded over decades. Younger generations didn't experience it directly. Physical evidence vanished. The story became something older people talked about occasionally. The current residents of areas that were once Camp Swift mostly don't know the history, see houses and schools and the National Guard facility, but don't connect them to the massive training camp that existed there. Don't imagine 90,000 soldiers and 10,000 prisoners occupying that landscape. Can't picture the scale of what happened in that place. The land looks ordinary now, shows few signs of its extraordinary past. The preservation of just 2 barracks and scattered foundations and Antoine's ruins seems inadequate given the magnitude of what happened there. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe training camps aren't meant to be permanently memorialized. Their purpose was temporary by design. Physical preservation matters less than remembering what they accomplished. Camp Swift prepared 300,000 soldiers for combat, contributed to victory, fulfilled its purpose, moved on. The transformation of some camp land into Cancer Research Center represents hopeful repurposing, place that prepared people for dealing death, now dedicated to preserving life. Redemption of sorts, though probably nobody planned it that way. The researchers working there today probably don't think about the soldiers who trained on that ground, focus on their work rather than history, which is as it should be. The federal prison on another portion of campland reminds us that society always needs facilities for confining people. Whether enemy soldiers during war or criminals during peace, containment remains necessary function that requires dedicated space. The prisoners held there today have nothing in common with German POWs except sharing landscape that's been used for incarceration in different contexts. The National Guard facility represents continuity. Military training still happens at Camp Swift, though on much smaller scale, soldiers still prepare for service. Though conflicts have changed, the connection between current training and World War II facility is direct even if most participants don't think about it. The name Camp Swift persists in that context, keeps memory alive in practical rather than commemorative way. The story of Camp Swift matters because it reveals patterns that repeated across America during World War II. Rural areas suddenly transformed by military necessity. Communities displaced to make room for camps and bases. Massive construction projects completed impossibly fast. Enemy prisoners working alongside civilians. Specialized units training in wrong terrain. Everything dismantled almost as quickly as it appeared. Understanding what happened at one camp helps us understand what happened at hundreds of others. The human element matters too. The displaced families, and the soldiers training, and the German prisoners, and the local residents adapting. All the individual experiences that collectively created something larger. All the choices and sacrifices and adjustments that victory required. Camp Swift wasn't just buildings and acreage and training schedules. It was people doing difficult things under extraordinary circumstances, leaving pieces of themselves in that place even after they moved on. The speed with which it all happened and then unhappened demonstrates American capacity for rapid transformation, ability to mobilize resources and labor on massive scale when existential threat demands it, then return to something approaching normalcy just as quickly when crisis passes. That capacity isn't always good, can cause harm through displacement and disruption, but it might be necessary for defending freedom, certainly proved essential for winning that war. The irony of elite mountain troops training in Texas heat before fighting in Italian mountains wasn't funny to soldiers living through it, but reveals larger truth about military preparation. Can't always train in ideal conditions, have to adapt to whatever circumstances exist. Flexibility matters as much as specialized skill. The 10th Mountain Division's success in Italy came partly from Colorado training, but also from maintaining discipline and cohesion during frustrating months at Camp Swift when nothing made sense. The German prisoners working Texas farms created strange relationships that transcended enmity, farmers and prisoners finding common ground through agricultural work, guards and prisoners developing grudging respect despite being enemies, local residents learning that enemy soldiers were human beings rather than monsters. Those relationships didn't change the fact of war, but complicated simple narratives about good and evil, showed that humanity persists even in the midst of terrible conflicts. The memorial for the German POW who died at Camp Swift and received military funeral honors exemplifies this complexity. American soldiers showing respect for dead enemy because Geneva Convention required it and because basic decency demanded it, treating death with solemnity regardless of whose death it was. The photograph of that funeral preserved in national archives serves as evidence that even during wartime, some civilized standards persisted. The complete disappearance of Camp Swift's physical presence, except scattered remnants, reminds us that even massive installations are temporary. Everything humans build eventually crumbles or gets repurposed or fades into landscape. Permanence is an illusion. What matters isn't physical preservation but remembering what happened and understanding why it mattered and passing those lessons to future generations who didn't experience it. Camp Swift trained soldiers who went on to fight in Europe and Pacific, thousands of young men who'd never left home before, suddenly preparing for combat in distant places, carrying fear and determination and hope they'd survive. Some died in battle, their time at Camp Swift representing final American soil they stood on, last place they felt relatively safe before entering horror of war. Their training there maybe gave them slight advantage that made difference between living and dying. The story reminds us that victory required more than courage on battlefields, required massive support infrastructure that organized and trained and supplied millions of soldiers, required commandeering land and displacing families and building instant cities, required German prisoners working American farms so food production wouldn't collapse, required elite ski troops training in Texas heat before fighting in Italian mountains. All of it necessary, all of it complicated, none of it simple or easy or without cost. Today, When you drive through that area of Bastrop County, you see housing developments and the National Guard facility and the federal prison and the UT Cancer Center, and not much indication that something extraordinary once happened there. That 100,000 people once occupied that landscape in service of defeating fascism. That Camp Swift represented American determination to win, regardless of what sacrifice victory required. The ordinariness of current landscape makes the wartime history seem almost unbelievable, hard to imagine such transformation and activity and purpose concentrated in one place for brief intense period. But it happened. The records prove it. The photographs document it. The veterans remembered it. The displaced families never forgot it. Camp Swift mattered, contributed to victory, served its purpose, earned its place in history, even if physical evidence has mostly vanished. The land still holds those memories, even if current occupants don't know them. The ground remembers what happened there, whether anyone else does or not. The local historians who've worked to preserve Camp Swift's story face challenges that afflict all efforts to document temporary wartime installations. Most participants are gone now. Photographs and documents scattered across archives, physical site transformed beyond recognition. But they persist in collecting oral histories and organizing records and creating exhibits because they understand that forgetting would be worse than the difficulty of remembering, that these stories deserve preservation even when preservation is hard. The Texas Historical Commission designated Camp Swift historically significant in 1996, official recognition that what happened there mattered enough to warrant formal acknowledgement. The designation doesn't restore buildings or return displaced families to their land, but affirms that the story has value, that future generations should know what occurred on that ground during those crucial years. The current Texas Military Department operates the retained portion of Camp Swift, manages it as training center for National Guard units and active forces, maintains connection between World War II facility and ongoing military mission. Soldiers training there today walk the same terrain where their predecessors trained 8 decades ago, probably don't consciously think about that continuity, but embody it through their presence and preparation. The economic impact of Camp Swift on Bastrop County during its active years was enormous, according to local accounts. Millions of dollars flowed into the community through contracts and purchases and soldier spending. Businesses expanded to serve the camp. New enterprises opened to meet demand. The sudden closure in 1946 created economic shock that took years to recover from. Boom times ended abruptly, leaving businesses that had invested in serving the camp suddenly without customers. Some local merchants who'd expanded during the war years went bankrupt when Camp Swift closed. Others adapted by diversifying or relocating. Survivors learned lessons about depending too heavily on military contracts that might disappear without warning. The economic cycle of military facility opening and closing repeated across America. Camp Swift, just one example of pattern that affected hundreds of communities. The soldiers who trained at Camp Swift and survived the war carried their experiences throughout their lives. Many never talked about it much because nothing dramatic happened there compared to combat. Training camp just seemed like preparation rather than significant experience in itself. But those months or years at Swift shaped them, taught them discipline and camaraderie and survival skills, prepared them psychologically for what they'd face overseas, even if they didn't realize it at the time. The German prisoners who spent time at Swift, mostly integrated back into German society after repatriation, became businessmen and workers and family men, tried to rebuild lives in devastated nation that bore little resemblance to the Germany they'd left. Some maintained contact with Americans they'd known during captivity, occasional letters or rare visits that bridged the gulf between former enemies, found that shared experience of Camp Swift created unexpected bonds. A few prisoners never returned to Germany, chose to emigrate to United States after repatriation became possible, built lives in country that had held them captive, married American women, and raised American children, and became citizens of nation they'd once fought against. Their stories represent the most dramatic reconciliation, transformation from enemy soldier to American citizen, proof that wartime enmity doesn't have to be permanent. The site where German prisoners were held at Camp Swift shows little evidence today of its function, the barbed wire and guard towers long gone, the compounds returned to other uses, nothing visible to indicate thousands of men once lived there under guard. The ground knows, but doesn't reveal, keeps its secrets unless someone specifically searches archives and documents to resurrect the buried past. The relationship between the 10th Mountain Division and Camp Swift illustrates larger patterns in military preparation. Specialized units don't always train in ideal conditions, have to adapt to available facilities, even when those facilities seem wrong for their mission. The division's time in Texas tested their mental resilience as much as physical capabilities, proved they could maintain focus and cohesion even when circumstances frustrated them, preparation that served them well in combat's chaos. The pack mules that caused the division so much trouble at Camp Swift never got deployed to Italy, according to military records. The animals trained for mountain work, but ultimately left behind when division shipped out, perhaps because logistics of transporting thousands of mules across Atlantic seemed impossible, perhaps because commanders decided mules weren't worth the complication. The soldiers probably didn't miss them, had developed hostile relationship with animals that kicked and bit and refused to cooperate, found combat easier than dealing with those notoriously stubborn creatures. The nurses trained at Camp Swift went on to extraordinary service, worked in field hospitals and evacuation stations, treated horrific wounds under impossible conditions, saved countless lives through skill and determination, and willingness to work beyond exhaustion. Their training at Swift gave them technical capabilities, but couldn't fully prepare them for emotional toll of combat medicine, watching young men die despite their best efforts, making triage decisions that haunted them forever. The memory of Camp Swift lives not in preserved monuments or museum exhibits, but in the land itself that absorbed all that activity and trauma and transformation, holds it still beneath housing developments and prison walls and National Guard training grounds. The descendants of displaced families sometimes return to walk property their grandparents once farmed, stand on ground where homes used to be, feel connection to past that defies the erasure of physical evidence. An elderly veteran who trained there in 1944 came back in the 1990s, walked the remaining National Guard portion trying to find the barracks where he slept before shipping to Pacific combat. Couldn't locate it among the few structures that survived, finally just stood in an open field and wept for reasons he couldn't fully explain to the family members who drove him there. The land remembered him even if he couldn't find specific places. His presence there reconnected him to the young man he'd been, the soldier who trained on that ground before learning what war actually meant. A German former prisoner returned in 1985 with his American wife and grown children, wanted to show them the place where he spent 2 years working Texas farms and learning English and deciding he preferred America to the Germany he left. He found almost nothing recognizable, the camp completely gone, the farms where he worked transformed, only the general landscape familiar. But standing there mattered anyway. Gave his family context for understanding his choices, let him make peace with complicated past that included being enemy soldier and prisoner, and eventually immigrant and citizen. Those personal pilgrimages happen occasionally still, fewer each year. As the generation that lived through Camp Swift dies off, soon nobody will have direct memory of the place during its active years. The transition from lived experience to historical record is nearly complete. Camp Swift becoming story rather than memory, something read about rather than remembered. Joining the countless other temporary wartime installations that served their purpose and disappeared. The story itself has power, if we choose to preserve it. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die.